Salzinger grew more ill with diabetes, which he'd suffered from his whole life. He had a dialysis machine installed in place, and so he didn't have to go to the hospital. And the person who was closest to him, who happens to be someone that I knew, who's a friend, came back from a trip to China where he had gone. It's the poet, some of you might know him, Stefan Kühne. He comes here occasionally and gives readings. And he came back and he found that one of the people who had gathered around Salzinger was a very outspoken, well, Nazi might be putting it too offensively, but a fascist nationalist German who had been in the German army and who was young enough at the time to be very vociferously outspoken about his fascist political views, which thoroughly enraged my friend, who was about as far at the other extreme as you could be. He became estranged and left. But the intrigue about the whole thing is it's kind of a sad story, because here was a man who did all this philanthropic work. He helped so many people. He helped, so much work was published and proliferated throughout the German world, German-speaking world, through him. And because of this one associate who offended all of his other friends so much that they all left, towards the end of his life, he had only this man, Wolfgang Winkler, and one other man, Peter Engstler, who was the man who had originally asked me to do the translation. These two people were the last people left with his wife around Salzinger when he finally died in 1993. And his wife inherited the estate, and it was willed by her to the publisher Engstler, who had contacted me after she died. And the whole idea of the money was that it was to be passed on to someone who would carry on the philanthropic work of Salzinger. And this was what my friend had been set up to do, quite consciously, by Salzinger. You know, I'm going to leave my money to you, and you're going to carry on this work. And then they were estranged. So it all went to his wife, and his wife died about 7 years later, and it all went to Engstler, who had his own publishing house. But he didn't continue the philanthropic work. He kept it as a personal fortune, which caused a terrible scandal among all the people who had known Salzinger, and people were very upset by it. And I arrived in Germany, and every single person that I came to talk about this with, you know, what can you tell me about Helmut Salzinger? They all started by saying, I don't know why you came to talk to me, I don't know anything about it. There was so much kind of darkness involved. I felt like I'd entered some kind of intrigue novel, and trying to be a good journalist, I just said, oh, and listened, and gradually more stories came out, and each person had a different point of view. And I did end up, I traveled to South Central Germany in the Bavarian region to meet with Peter Engstler, and we talked for several days about Salzinger and his relationship to him, which was a very different point of view than I had heard from Stefan. And then I went north to Hamburg and spoke with Michael Keller, who is a photographer and publisher and writer. And he had his version of the story, and then I went on and spent the day with Wolfgang Winkler, the fascist, still fascist, which was, believe me, I was spooked out by this whole thing. I have to say I was really spooked out. It was exciting and fun and very spooked outing. I myself am quite the opposite of a fascist. It's about as far the other way as you can go, not surprisingly. And he is the only person left of Salzinger's circle still living in that region. And I really had the aspiration to spend time taking the walks that Salzinger had taken and maybe see some of the wildlife, because he's very much into ecopoetics, very much into the countryside that he lived in, and very much into the animal and insect and every kind of life that was there. So this was my one entree because it was so far out in the boondocks. My original idea of renting a bicycle and going there and bicycling around really wasn't tenable. And it's very hard to get much information about little tiny towns anywhere. So I took him up on it. I took the train to Kagenberger, which is the closest town, and he picked me up at the station, and he drove me to Odisheim, where the head farm, which is the commune, and Salzinger's old house was. We went and we looked at it, and it had completely changed. There was no garden in the backyard. Although it's the only place in the neighborhood, the whole back lot was covered with trees because his gardening brought the trees in. It was very interesting, and he's written about that in a book of his called Gardener in the Jungle, which goes into his life of gardening and the experience of the whole ecology of his yard changing through cultivating. Anyway, so there I was with this very courtly, kind of Reagan-esque, gentlemanly, hyper-conservative, I don't even know if you can call it conservative, driving around looking at things in the neighborhood, and I was able to take the few pictures that I have of that area while I was moving, which was nice. And he made a little bit of an effort to draw me into conversation about how it was a healthy national feeling of pride in one's homeland, the whole homeland thing. And put me on the train and I went back. But I was full of kind of dismay as well as delight at this whole experience. And I did finish the translation of the second chapbook that I'd been asked to do, which is called The Bird Exposition, Vogelschau in German. And I was very intrigued by his poetry, which has it's very eccentric, and he has a kind of an odd, I want to say, voice. And the picture that I arrived at, both through his poetry and his writing, as well as discussions with people, is someone who retained at its core this very strong German intellectualism, which gave him very strong ideas about how things should be done and how things should be translated and what was the right kind of translation, what was the wrong kind, as well as, I would say, he was the kind of ecologist who sort of sincerely did not really like people very much, and kind of would have preferred if they had not been part of the ecology. His poetry is very kind of stark in a way. I mean, it's full of wonder at the natural world, and full of a kind of almost jaded, it's like deism, the feeling that the world is set in motion by something, but there's nothing that really cares about anything out there. And if we knew what was best, we would just dissolve ourselves into it and stay away from human society largely. And then on the other hand, he still had those roots where he wished for the acclaim that he had had when he was younger, regretted the fact that people were no longer interested in what he had to say since he had become a commune hippie, more or less. There's some great photos of him and a number of different poets and writers sitting around, in jeans and long hair and hats and things. It's nice. And for those of you who saw the announcements,